have a feeling that someday people will say it's a fine nonsense.
The events that lead to social collapse are always overdetermined.
This is one of the reasons that scholars of antiquity often struggle to explain the disappearance of ancient civilizations.
We can observe, for instance, the decline of the Bronze Age civilizations around the Mediterranean region through archaeological and historical sources, but we cannot make out the primary cause of collapse.
Some scholars emphasize the long run forces like agricultural and environmental factors.
Others point out the ubiquity of late Bronze Age sources that describe waves of invaders arriving to capture and pillage societies across the region.
The fact remains social collapse is overdetermined. It's impossible to separate the short and the long term factors because any single variable is unnecessary to the broader effect.
But we're not archaeologists,
We're podcasters.
and we have the benefit of seeing in real time the contingent and continuous factors that drive the cogs and gears of history away from progress and toward decline.
That's the reason we've been telling this story about cryptocurrency fraud in Seminole County. It's a story sitting at the nexus of the short and long run forces that are undermining the social forms and institutions that have built modernity.
This will be our last entry in the Seminole County series for the time being, but we expect to return to the story in the coming months as Greenberg's sentencing approaches and we anticipate more indictments on the way.
But today, we're going to do two things.
First, we're going to lay out our motives for telling the story.
Second, we want to spend some time on the characters associated with Joel Greenberg's Seminole County Tax Collection Agency, who are so far unscathed by the federal litigation.
This is a show about decline and structural crisis in the 21st century, not political corruption. Why have we been telling this Seminole County story?
I think that the answer to that question has two parts. The first involves a description and an understanding of cryptocurrency. But the other thing that we need to do is sort of describe our vector of critique of American political institutions. And so to start with that first thing about cryptocurrency and where we think it fits in to these processes of decline, we need to consider that cryptocurrency is like a corrosive substance on our social institutions. The capacity of states to intervene in elite affairs is muted and diminished when you introduce competing non-state currencies, especially ones that are intentionally hard to censor. Cryptocurrencies create a non-state space from whence states can struggle, right, to intervene and regulate. That's the purpose of them. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is usually sold as a benefit to people, like broadly, that these transactions are peer-to-peer and uncensored, and that's sold as increasing liberty for individuals, right? For consumers, for, everyday people. But normal people aren't doing transactions that they have to worry about being censored by the state.
Mm-hmm.
People who worry about having censored transactions are more often than not quite wealthy, right? Have something to be gained or lost from too much state oversight into what they're doing with their money. In order to argue against the Bitcoin maximalists, we have to deal with this argument that they'll put forward, which is in response to what I've laid out here,
Yeah.
which is that cryptocurrency financial crimes are are a part of the continuity, right? That they are indistinguishable from other types of financial crime that's gone on historically, right? And therefore, you shouldn't critique cryptocurrency for the crimes that are committed with it, because people use and have used fiat currency, state currency,
Right. Right.
censorable currency transactions to
Yeah.
do plenty of illegal things, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so on the one hand, you have this argument about continuity. Even Bennett Tomlin isn't sure that there's a distinction between financial crimes of the past and what we have right now.
Yeah.
He makes this point about the American scam,
Mhm.
and that he thinks it's just a vector for that cultural influence.
Right. Scam artists were able to latch onto this quickly, when this took hold in the mainstream. But like, I don't know. I don't think that cryptocurrency is necessarily going to bring about, democratic means, in the financial world anytime soon, like people sort of thought was going to happen. I think that like there's kind of this view, I feel like, in the cryptocurrency world that oh, we have this technology now that could be democratizing. But those folks themselves haven't realized that like they don't have the
Mhm.
capital themselves to take control of this market, or whatever you want to call it. The capital,
Right.
that does exist to take control of it has already been used by those who hold the majority of it. To me, the war is already lost on this topic, even though conceptually it sounds very nice.
I think people underestimate the centrality of states' monopoly on currency to social stability. That it's conspicuous that one of the first things that the founders do after they go to the trouble of remaking the federal government is to get rid of all of the state level currency that had existed under the Articles of Confederation. And that this process of centralizing both currency and then eventually, banking and certain financial institutions has largely been what put the brakes on what was going on in the 19th century, right? The
Yeah.
forces of unbridled industrial capitalism. Real maximalists basically understand this, right? That if the state monopoly on currency weren't important, then cryptocurrency wouldn't have the transformative capacity that they say it has.
Yeah.
And note the way the maximalists will sort of rhetorically downplay this and
Right.
downplay this corrosive aspect, when the only way for cryptocurrency to have the capacity that it has is if it is going to degrade and deteriorate these social structures and their connection and relationship to state monopoly on currency.
Yeah. Yeah. Had the world been a little different in terms of wealth inequality, when this technology came around, maybe things might be a little different, but it hasn't. I mean, cryptocurrency, like I was just saying, was introduced at a point in history, where wealth inequality is at its greatest. So those
Right.
those who control the majority of it, you know, saw their window, took advantage of it, and here we are.
I think that throughout our process of doing this series, we've picked up a lot of new listeners who are very invested in the partisan rhetoric that has surrounded anti corruption and anti Donald Trump politics over the
Mhm.
last 5 years. And we want to kind of articulate where we stand on that issue. What we see in American politics is, you sort of have the party of business broadly, which is the Republican Party. And then you have the party of big business and existing capital, right? And that's the Democrats. The key distinction between those two parties is that the Republicans think that the most effective way to serve the ruling class is by weakening the state. And Democrats think the most effective way to serve the ruling class is through the maintenance of the state as enshrined by the US Constitution.
Yeah.
We make this point just to acknowledge that we understand that the corruption in Florida that we've been describing is unique to the Republican Party in mostly aesthetic ways, right? That it's occurring, in this sort of context of a political agenda that wants to weaken and diminish the capacity of the state to intervene and to govern, right? And so when you see that political party and that political agenda do corrupt things, it looks like this. When you can have political corruption on the other side of the aisle, that doesn't look like Joel Greenberg and all of these other things, but is nonetheless present. I want to go ahead and gesture towards the University of Illinois at Chicago's annual corruption report. If you go and you look at their top 10, it's a pretty good mix of red and blue up there. And Florida isn't even in the top 10.
Yep.
Now they are number 11, but it's just worth considering that as a factor. Now, I think, like, methodologically, the UIC corruption report is often measuring corruption through conviction, right? Through people who end up convicted for these kinds of things. So I think oftentimes it can be a better measure of how seriously states are about policing corruption, right? I think that's almost more likely than it being a direct measurement of how corrupt a state is. But we have measurable degrees of this type of behavior, regardless of your political vector in American politics.
Yeah.
And the reason that we have been telling this story about political corruption in the United States is because we think that it is of the variety that we will continue to see increasingly as cryptocurrencies ebb and flow with this sort of broader context of social and political decline.
Going back to cryptocurrency here, if you push the cryptocurrency maximalists into the corner with this argument that we've been making so far, then they will usually pivot to a critique of the state itself. What are we here saying about the state?
I want to be very clear that we are not in describing decline and structural crisis over the next 80 years as a focus and a theme for this show. We are not mourning the passing of the modern state. We are not proponents of what the modern state has been and what it has done, right? We are critics of it. I think that that's important to establish, and then point this other thing out, which is that in American society, which has a very underdeveloped anarchist left, that anarchic ideas in the United States are often controlled and filtered through the lens of the right. Anti-state sentiment in the United States is co-opted by the most powerful people here. And that there's plenty of very powerful people in the American ruling class that are opposed to at least the US federal government for a range of ideological reasons. And that's always been present in American culture and society. So when you talk about the state in the United States, even as a critic of it, it's hard to be happy to see it pass into history when that passing seems to be so facilitated by the right and its interests and agendas.
Is that really the term? Homo nationalism? Really?
It's a very crunchy academic term,
We're
basically.
getting into some theory for a hot second here.
I don't know how I feel about that term. That's kind of. Is that really an academic term?
Created by a Muslim woman, yeah.
So it's
Christ.
and we're using it as a way to like spotlight Jacob Ingalls in a way that hasn't been done before.
So I'm going to be completely honest here. I did not realize Jacob Ingalls.
Yep. And we need to sort of establish that his Facebook Live where he's like calling out Brian Butte, and basically he says out directly out of his mouth, "Oh, by the way, you can't attack me because if you do that, you'll be attacking a gay journalist." Right? Like it just straight up says it.
There's some decent stuff at the end of that YouTube interview you sent also that I was planning on referencing anyway, that are like perfect synopses of what we're going to get into. So those bites are there if you hadn't heard them yet. Also.
So we now turn to the characters in our story who are still walking among us today. Joining us is Austin Madrick. He's a district director for the Democrats in suburban Chicago and a 3-time guest on COINTELPRO. He's written about homo nationalism and right-wing politics. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, good to be with you boys once again.
You've focused a lot on Jacob Ingalls and his career as a journalist and right-wing provocateur in Central Florida, and the various ways in which he has antagonized the political opponents of Joel Greenberg and Chris Dorworth. Austin, what is homo nationalism?
So basically, homo nationalism is a portmanteau, a combination of the words homonormativity and nationalism, right? So we got to go down the rabbit hole just a little bit more. And in talking about homonormativity, need to first discuss its opposite in many ways, heteronormativity.
Which is the one you've probably heard.
Right, exactly. We live in a heteronormative society. That's maybe one of the buzzwords that you have heard. This is an idea largely coming out of LGBTQ studies and queer theories and stuff like that, that when I say heteronormative, what you really need to think about is like the nuclear family, basically, are a set of norms, ideas, values that we in a society, but also politically, economically, touches on everything, right? These conceptions we have about how society should be ordered, and at the center of that is a heteronormative set of ideas, right? So emphases on a husband and a wife, right? In marriage is something to be sought after, that those marriages should only be between folks of opposite genders, but also has a lot of emphasis on productivity and procreation, any associated values of domesticity and consumerism, which brings about that certain type of morality that is conjured up, I think, when you think about like suburbia and its advent, for example, right? Also includes things like a rigid adoption of the gender binary, right? There is only male, there is only female. All of what I would kind of sum into if one were to talk about straight privilege in this society, right? Everything that conjures is essentially heteronormativity. So then we ask, what is homonormativity? And it is basically taking all of those values of heteronormativity and fusing them onto LGBTQ culture, identity, politics, right? So one of the best ways I think to think about this is the overwhelming arguments in the LGBTQ rights debate here in the United States, largely in the Western world, right, in the last 30 years, really since it's kind of entered the mainstream as a predominant political, force, is on marriage, is on equity in marriage, on equity in accessing the tax structures you get from marriage, on being able to adopt children, on all of these things, right, which don't necessarily hit at the direct support, foundational support of access to housing, right? LGBTQ people in the United States can still technically be evicted just for being queer in various states in the United States, right? Conversion therapy, which gets to the very heart of, mental health and being able to live as an open LGBTQ person in society, still allowed in many states. But the overwhelming argument for so long were about the more tangible heteronormative originally ideas: marriage, having kids, owning a house together, having your white picket fence, all of those things, right? And so homonormativity has kind of always been at this friction point in the LGBTQ rights debate, right? Between what does actual freedom for queer people look like versus assimilation, essentially, right?
Right.
So then add into all of that a society which accepts, you know, LGBTQ marriage and things like that nowadays, add into that the nationalism pieces, and we arrive at homo nationalism, which is essentially is a way for folks who you would otherwise think wouldn't be supporters of the LGBTQ community, using, for example, the United States' acceptance of LGBTQ people as critique of why in the world, say, would you support countries in the Middle East where it is, you know, the death penalty still exists for LGBTQ people, right? As then a means to justify actions that we would take in the Middle East. This homo nationalism terms first coined, I should give a shout out to scholar Jasbir Pawar of Rutgers University. And so that's kind of the general strokes of it, right? And it's kind of used reflexively sometimes, that folks on the right will not only use it to critique these other places internationally where we're getting involved in, but also to say, how can you critique the United States, right? We allow LGBTQ people to live and thrive and survive here versus these other places in the world, right? And is often used as a way to say, look, America's not all that bad at all, right? Come on to America, or Israel does this, for example, because they are technically
Right.
an oasis in the Middle East. You know, for LGBTQ people, they don't have many rights protections that even the United States has, but it's not illegal to be gay. You can have a family in Israel, right?
Right.
And so they prop themselves up as, look, we are such a moral, progressive, forward-thinking nation because we allow for these things, when most of the people using those, you know, tactics are ones who would be perfectly fine with gay people being locked back in the closet forever. You know?
And we see this application of homo nationalism across the political spectrum in the
Right.
West, right? We see conservatives critiquing foreign countries and supporting US hegemony under this framework, the same way that we can find progressives and liberals upset about a Formula One race in Saudi Arabia or
Right.
something, while their tax dollars have done more to legitimize that state than an entire season of F1 in Jeddah could ever accomplish.
Exactly.
What about queer and gay people on the right? Why do we see young people like Jacob Ingalls or even Milo Yiannopoulos come to the fore as spokespeople on the right?
Yeah, I think that ultimately what leads to the kind of rise in this, I don't know that I call it a phenomenon, but that's the first word that's coming to mind. It's converging factors, right? Pew has just released some polling, I think either this year or last year, that showed for the first time ever since they have been tracking attitudes towards LGBTQ people in the United States, that a small majority of Republicans recognize that same-sex marriage is the reality in the United States, and a slim majority, something like 55% of them, largely are in support of recognizing that as reality. Never happened before. Majority of Republicans support same-sex marriage, essentially, right? So you get that combination with there's a very small subset, but it seems to be growing every year, of these conservative LGBTQ folks, right? But the crux that they have is often this battle between, do they feel accepted in the LGBTQ community as a Republican? And do they feel accepted in the Republican Party, which may, you know, is for a lot of them, I think, the general expression, the conduit, like for so many of us, of their political beliefs. They're naturally more conservative. The Republican Party is where they can go for that. Do they feel accepted in the LGBTQ community as a Republican, or do they feel accepted in the Republican Party as a member of the LGBTQ community, right? And increasingly over the past couple of years, you're finding more and more LGBTQ conservatives saying yes to that latter point and no to the first. No, they do not find themselves being able to be openly Republican, quote unquote, in queer circles, but find it slightly easier to be an out queer person in the Republican Party, right? And so I think then you add that on to a president like Trump, who, and this kind of brings the homo nationalism point back into it, spoke as a Republican presidential nominee for the first time in history, said nice things about queer people at the 2016 Republican National Convention, right? But if you look at specifically what he says, it's grounded entirely in homo nationalism and nationalism, period, right? He doesn't say, as your next president, if elected, I fully pledge my support to the LGBTQ community. No, he says, and a reminder for listeners that this is just weeks after the shooting in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub happened, that Trump delivers these remarks, right? And he says, that he will do everything in his power to protect LGBTQ citizens from the violence and oppression of a hateful foreign ideology.
Right.
Specifically what he says, right? And so you get this kind of confluence of all of these things together, and then you get these figures like Jacob Engels or like Milo Yiannopoulos, who take the aspects, I think Milo especially, but you watch interviews of Jacob Engels and he's got Roger Stone's Coke bottle sunglasses, and he's has a flair about him also, right, that Milo has. And I think that they kind of pull some of these campy elements that are traditional to the LGBTQ community, being flamboyant, all this stuff, package it into probably a personal, more conservative bent, but found a space in the Republican Party, and specifically in the Trump wing of the Republican Party, where they can come out and say, look, I can be openly gay. I can weaponize that against people, progressives, Democrats, other people in the LGBTQ community who I feel ostracized by. And I can make a little money probably doing this grift also, right? And so I think that's why you find, like, they pop up one-on-one. First it's Milo, and then it's another person that comes in, and you've got like Guy Benson at PragerU, who's the more like academic side of it, but he's still a conservative through and through, selling the grift. And then you've got, Jacob Engels doing the thing for Roger Stone, who flamboyant in his own right in many ways.
And I think people underestimate how deep these currents are, right? That I think a lot of times people look at liberals and people left of center and their language and attitudes towards gender and sexuality and say that is the vanguard, the fulcrum on which progressive gender and sexual politics have moved in the United States. The momentum comes from people a lot more like Jacob Engels and Milo Yiannopoulos. It's Hollywood, and TV producers who wanted to make media to normalize this, right? Who have interests more in line with capital and conservatives than they do with university professors and college students.
Yeah. And I think you're right to hit on the media piece here, because I think that perhaps predictably, there were many over the decades of the queer rights movement struggle in this country who levy these critiques. So I'm certainly not the first one and stand on their shoulders. But the representation in the media piece is really important, because I think the standpoint that we're at now for the queer rights movement is one that I don't want to disparage the rights victories that we have, because they, especially as a queer person saying this, have had fundamental positive impacts on the lives of queer people in this country, right? There's no doubt about that. But once same-sex marriage got legalized, and then, thankfully the Supreme Court a year or two ago or whatever said you can't be, fired for being gay or trans at this point. But that's kind of where it had held off at, right? There's still plenty of trans folks who are looking around the community saying, where are we doing the fight for our rights, right? And some of that does also stem from that homo nationalism front, right? The homonormativity, with its more rigid conceptions of gender, for example, is one of the root causes you find transphobia still amongst the LGB community, at least, right? And so we're not there yet. We're kind of the status point where queer people are generally, in most parts of the country at least, not discriminated against anymore, right? So it opens up the door then for these folks like Jacob Engels, who say, this is just a facet of who I am. They may not feel like it's a core part of their identity specifically, but have taken over, are co-opting that rights argument, kind of like what you were hinting at, of, you can't attack me because I'm gay, or you can't invalidate my point on these issues because I'm gay, which is a total turn on what we've seen before and what we've seen from the right-wing LGBTQ folks. That's kind of one of the newer developments, especially.
So Jacob Engels and the Central Florida Post were taken offline for a period of weeks, right? As he and Roger Stone claimed that a left-wing hack of the site had taken it down. Researchers and people who have been following the story had speculated that this was in fact an effort to purge information and posts that had appeared on Jacob Ingles' media outlet and hopefully cover off ongoing litigation for Stone and potentially future litigation for Ingles. Yeah, and this involved a period of time where he was asking for paltry sums when we think about the wealth of the characters involved in this whole story, asking for like $6,000 or $7,000 or something, in order to get his website back online or something like that. And it just all didn't seem to add up that a left-wing hack could really indefinitely take down your website for weeks, and then you would be able to fix that with $7,000. It was a strange thing, but as of our recording time, it seems that the Central Florida Post is back online with the headlining article, "Foreign Hackers Tried to Silence Us. It Didn't Work." A story by Jacob Ingles from December 7th.
Jimmy Patronis is Governor Ron DeSantis' chief financial officer. It was his office that loaned hundreds of thousands of dollars to Joel Greenberg at the end of 2017 and 2018. What do we make of this?
I think broadly, what we've described in Florida here is a conspicuous lack of oversight on behalf of the state level checks and controls on the local government. But beyond that, we want to emphasize the relevance of the Florida GOP to national politics, right? That the dominance of the Republican Party in Florida is critical to them maintaining any semblance of control over America's political institutions as a minority party. There is very little incentive at any level of the Republican Party to say anything damaging or detrimental about the DeSantis administration or any Republican politics in Florida. And so I think that that's important to kind of keep front and center when we look at Ron DeSantis and Jimmy Patronis, the chief financial officer. I think that in addition to Patronis loaning the money to Joel Greenberg is the creation of the Florida Blockchain Task Force in September of 2019. So we have Joel Greenberg doing his things, in 2017, 2018, and then by 2019, the investigation starts to sort of close around Greenberg, and it's in early 2020 that he is probably definitely aware of the extent to which his goose was cooked. But just before the heat started to pick up on Greenberg, Ron DeSantis, through the chief financial officer, created this task force to develop a master plan for integrating blockchain into Florida state financial institutions, right? And accepting it in much the same way that other states, national states, we've seen include an attempt to incorporate cryptocurrency. With all of that said, I think it's worth pointing out how many people in this story have said to me that they think that Joel Greenberg was running beta for the DeSantis administration. That is something that almost everyone I've talked to in this story, has at least suspected. Considering the proximity of Jimmy Patronis to, not just Governor Ron DeSantis, but he was also CFO under Governor Rick Scott, right? He is a high-ranking, trusted member of the Florida State GOP. And the fact that he is still the acting chief financial officer for the state of Florida tells you the extent to which the powers that be in Florida are enmeshed in all of this. To take it a step further, we need to talk once again about Mike Ertel, who was one mid-2000s Halloween costume away from still being the Secretary of State in Florida. This story, it's hard to say whether or not Mike and Michelle Ertel would have still had their contracts with the Greenberg tax agency if Ertel had still been Secretary of State. But it's easy to imagine that being the headline on this story if Ertel is the acting Secretary of State when everything closes around Greenberg, right? So we've got Mike Ertel and Michelle Ertel both in the pay of the Greenberg tax agency. I've been told by a source that when all the stuff closed around Greenberg, the Ertels were worried that they were going to be indicted as well. And so all of this about the Ertels is made more important in the context of Jimmy Patronis, the chief financial officer, because Patronis currently, at this moment, employs Zane Ertel as the regional manager for the CFO in Central Florida. So this is the son of Mike and Michelle Ertel managing the financial operations in Central Florida, where we're telling this story. This goes to reinforce the conspicuous proximity of all of these actors to Ron DeSantis and to this Florida State GOP more broadly. And I think that Jimmy Patronis is one of these figures that I wonder if we won't return to tell his story in more detail in the coming months.
So last week we discussed Mr. Chris Dorworth. With all we've laid out about Dorworth and his connections to Joel Greenberg, surely an indictment is coming out of the federal circuit court, right?
One might imagine that could be the case in the coming months. But aside from stepping down at Brian Ballard's lobbying firm, there have been no real consequences for Dorworth's evident association with Greenberg. And it's important to emphasize that that association at this point only goes as far as being frequently photographed with Joel Greenberg, in Greenberg's presence at the when they were at the White House. There's a kind of funky video of Greenberg that Dorworth is filming that we'll talk about here in a second. But short of having subpoena power, it's hard to find another connection back to Dorworth connecting to the criminal acts for which Joel Greenberg has pleaded guilty in federal court. But I think obviously we should keep our powder dry on that topic until we can see the indictments that might be handed down over the next few months. It seems likely that things will change in that direction. We know that Chris Dorworth worked with Jacob Ingalls in the character assassination of Jay Miller. The county commission did not vote did not approve the resolution for the River Cross housing development. The political pressure applied by Save Rural Seminole, the threat to incorporate Geneva and these other parts of Seminole County, was sufficient to make the county commission vote against River Cross, which led Dorworth to file a lawsuit in federal court, which was thrown out, but there's still one that he's pursuing that is saying that the referendum passed by Seminole County citizens in 2004 is vague and too broad, and that they can't, they basically, the word and will of Seminole County voters in 2004 should not be applied, is not sufficient to prevent this land development. Dorworth went to federal court and tried to argue that the 2004 referendum was a violation of like civil rights law, and the court said no to that. And I want to sort of use that as a way to kind of talk about the type of Republican that Chris Dorworth is. Chris Dorworth is not the down in the mud, dirty trickster Roger Stone in his public persona. He's the type of Republican who, when he was in office, argued for compulsory ultrasounds to women seeking abortion on the grounds that it gave women more choice, right? One of these kinds of Republicans. And so in that vein, argues that efforts to preserve the ecology of rural Seminole are racist and segregationist. But I want to talk about Dorworth, as another one of these symptomatic characters, right? Because Chris Dorworth, as he told the Orlando Sentinel, that, quote, even if I were to die tomorrow, end quote, that another developer will be gunning to do the exact same thing. And another one after that, and another one after that. That the effort to develop rural Seminole County is a overdetermined force, just like these other things that we're talking about in this episode. And I think that's basically true, and I think there's a lot of arguments to be made for why we need more housing. Obviously eating up more land in Central Florida is complicated, and we certainly don't we're no friends of Rivercross here on this show.
To hear Matt Gaetz speak in public right now is to appreciate that he's probably the most intelligent person we've talked about in Greenberg's circle, and we acknowledge that's a low bar.
I've listened to a lot of Matt Gaetz over the last month, and he is like a Tucker Carlson level, like conservative shit poster.
Mm-hmm.
But he's got this sort of like Frank Luntz capacity for like rhetorical deniability. And the denial that he issued back in April or whatever it was when the story was first breaking, Roger Stone could have written it. It was like it was that total and utter deniability and inversion of the claims against you, right? And so he's, I think Matt Gaetz is either going to be swallowed up by this, or he is going to come out of it one of the most powerful politicians in Washington. In fact, he said that if they can get the House next time, that he wants to have a spot on the Judiciary Committee so that he can go after the people who are going after him. And I think that's what I've taken away from Gaetz is that he's terrifyingly self-aware. It goes to the extent, and this is something that @gal_suburban told us a couple of episodes ago, is, Gaetz was asked about Epstein and articulated very clearly the reasons why elites use young women to gain leverage over each other, right? And that more than, the sex or the criminality of it, it's this, system of leverage that is used to ensure that powerful people are amenable to other more powerful people. And when you add all of this up, right, I think Matt Gaetz becomes someone not to joke about, because I think Gaetz is another one of these people symptomatic of where we're headed and the type of politician that we will see more of, not less of, the same way we will see more
Right.
developers like Dorworth, and more political rhetoric and propagandizing like Jacob Ingalls. Yeah, we've said that Gates was, photographed at the White House with Dorworth and Greenberg. They were invited as guests to the Trump White House. And we have, in addition, this very strange video of Greenberg and Gates and cannabis monopolist and Orlando attorney John Morgan doing like a Facebook Live video together or something to that effect, where so Dorworth films while John Morgan apologizes to Joel Greenberg for not believing in him when Greenberg promised that DeSantis would allow smokable medical marijuana, right? And so John Morgan, in addition to being an attorney, is this cannabis monopolist in Florida, and he's there, like, sort of smirking at all the money he's going to make and eating crow by apologizing to Joel Greenberg while Dorworth films, right? And and then all of a sudden Matt Gaetz also pops onto the screen, and all of a sudden, like, I began to sort of wonder why one of them wasn't holding that day's newspaper or something. It all sort of took on the vibe of like a hostage situation or something, that they'd all been sort of uncomfortably put up to it by Chris Dorworth or something. But they're doing all of this in front of a sign on the wall that says Dorworth Family Pool. Like,
oh, this is like, I assume this was just like a conversation they were having, not like a...
Yeah, this is like, it's like Morgan had promised that if DeSantis did what Greenberg said, that they would have this, that he would do like a public apology. And this is that public apology. And for some reason, Matt Gaetz is also there at Chris Dorworth's house with
Bizarre.
Joel Greenberg and John Morgan. And at one point, Morgan jokes that Dorworth is his lobbyist. And they have to, and there's sort of like this joking, like playing that off like that is a joke, but there's like a split second where it's definitely not a joke. Where you can practically feel Dorworth shaking his head at John Morgan when he says that he's his lobbyist. And Morgan has to go, oh no, I mean, I'm kidding. He's too expensive, like. It's an astounding video, and like I said, I'm not sure our discussion of it is going to be in the cut.
Of course, he's got the cigar. Of course.
Well, no, he's got a vape. He's vaping.
Oh, is that
like
what it
CBD? It's like a CBD vape, like that. He's like a. You know what's weird? You know what's really, really, really weird is that the guy that beat Dorworth, Mike Cleland, is an attorney at John Morgan's firm. I don't know what to do with that, but that's a fact I know.
I mean, all I can say, and perfectly fine if none of this makes it into the final cut, but all I can say is this does reek a little bit of, you see quite often in these things that smell funny when it comes to, politics and all of these webs, that they often do start from their homegrown dynastic sort of things, right? Like, in Chicago, if you look at the machine, it all kind of starts to stem from a very particular place, from the dailies, Mike Madigan, a disgraced former speaker of the state, originally comes out of, the original daily and that machine, right? And it all kind of grows from this particular place. Matt Gaetz, his parents are politically well connected, and this is all in the center of a place in Florida politics, which is, very much at the root of all these. So there are elements that certainly smell funny in all of the ridiculous ways that they start to when schemes like this come about.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.